Alright, I want to talk about hypercarries in Honkai Star Rail. For some quick context as to what got me thinking about this, in my previous video one of the things that I mentioned is that specialized relic sets could be a way for Hoyo to make underutilized supports better. One of the comments on that video, shoutout Shirker12, was that farming relics to make underutilized supports better kinda just sucks due to the nature of RNG with relic farming. Now, as to how that relates to this video, my thought process was that, well, they're not wrong. Farming relics does suck, but in my opinion it actually only sucks for specific cases, and it sucks more for certain types of units than others, namely hypercarries, or more specifically, solo hypercarries. See, when you're farming relics to make a support usable, generally the most important stat is going to be speed, and after that it's not actually your stats that matter, but your traces. There's a few exceptions like Sparkle and Branya who want a ton of crit damage, but those units don't actually need more than a crit damage body to become usable. For something like a super break DPS, all you really need to consider is break effect and then attack or speed depending on which unit you're using. Some of them like Firefly or Zui don't even need to go fishing for an elemental orb because they prefer a generic attack % one instead. Alongside that, Firefly is an exception in that outside of niche speed tuning scenarios for her E2 or running sustainless comps, you don't need any speed from your substats at all, which docks a required stat from her list. For a follow-up DPS, the reliance on an extra sub-DPS unit combined with high team synergy through various buffs means that you can get away with lower investment and still do well. Similarly, dot teams rely on multiple units to apply different debuffs to the enemy, landing that niche in the same spot as the others that have more than one unit dealing the brunt of the damage. Now here's the problem, when you look at a hypercarry DPS you need a ton of different stats. You need high attack, you need a solid amount of crit rate, you need to have decent crit damage, you need to have the right speed depending on what supports you're using, you need good multipliers on all your abilities, and you also have to fish for that elemental orb to make full use out of your unit. To put this into perspective, basically what I'm saying is that if you were to roll for a support, let's say Robin, and then you were to roll for a hypercarry, let's say Ambibitor Dan Heng, both within the same patch, it will take you exponentially longer to get a usable Dan Heng before you get a usable Robin. If you look at any of the endgame modes, you can enter those without a fully invested support. For example, a 3k attack Robin on an HP shirt instead of one with a full attack build and Von Whack with speed tuned substats and all that, and she's still going to give your team a ton of value. On the other hand, if you enter those same game modes without a fully invested DPS, like a Dan Heng with 50 crit rate and 100 crit damage, the mileage you get between the two units will be very different. In my opinion, this is where we come to the crux of the hypercarry unit's main issue. Their problem isn't their support, so that does play a part. It's also not that one DPS unit may be better or worse than the other. What it really comes down to is stat requirements. Let me frame this out for you. The general baseline of speed that most units want to get to is 134. If you take every sustain and support in the game, excluding debuffers because those can be considered DPS, the average base speed between all of them is 101. This means that with level 15 speed boots and min rolls when you get your substats, you only have to roll speed 4 times across all of your pieces to hit that 134 threshold. On the other hand, with a level 15 crit rate body and the 5% crit that you start with, you only get 37.4% crit rate. If we favor crit rate a little bit by giving it average rolls for substats instead of min rolls, getting 4 rolls only puts you at 49% crit rate. This means that on average, even with better rolls, less than half of your attacks are critting. As a result of this, it feels like stats that different types of units need just isn't really balanced, because the stat breakpoints that supports need to work correctly are a lot more forgiving than what DPS units need, and the main stats you get from your relics only makes that more obvious. On top of all this, relic sets just matter significantly less for supports than they do for a DPS. A DPS like Acheron will lose a decent bit of damage if you don't have her on the 4-piece diver set, whereas a unit like Robin just needs a bit of speed and then as much attack as she can get, regardless of whether that attack comes from a set bonus or a random piece that has a bunch of it. As a personal anecdote, I recently got Robin this patch, and I just ran her on leftover Firefly pieces that had a bunch of attack % for the first few weeks, rather than using sets that give 12% attack like Musketeer or whatever, and she did more than enough to clear all content in the game. I do think it's also worth mentioning that relics aren't the only source for these stats. Traces play a big part too. If we continue to look at the two earlier examples with Robin and Dan Heng, Robin can make use of pretty much all the stats that she gains from her traces. The speed she gets helps her reach different thresholds without having to rely on any kind of RNG, the attack directly translates into buffs for her kit, and the HP helps her stay alive while she's not able to take any actions during her ult. On the other hand, Dan Heng gets a minor trace of HP that's basically useless. Even within the global DPS role, not everyone is equal. For example, all of Acheron's minor traces have value. On top of that, some units get better use out of their major traces, like how all 3 of Fei Zhao's directly translate to increased damage, whereas Dan Heng has one that gives him CC resistance. Apart from supports versus hyper carries, it's also worth looking at the new age version of DPS, Super Break units. As I mentioned earlier, similar to supports, a Super Break DPS's stat requirements are just significantly less than that of a hyper carry. All you really have to worry about for them is break effect, and then sometimes speed or attack depending on the unit. Even someone like Boothill, who doesn't always go fully into Super Break by using the Harmony Trailblazer, still wants a ton of it because it directly translates into buffs from his traces and talent. Essentially what I'm saying is that these other roles and these other niches have a significantly lower barrier of entry than units in the hypercarry niche do. Arguably, even the supports for the niche are harder to get. For example, a basic Firefly Super Break team uses a completely free unit in the Harmony Trailblazer, and then Gallagher, who is free twice, both in the Anniversary and in the Origami Bird event. All of this culminates in a kind of dead niche because the requirements to play it are just too high, in that they need too many things from too many sources. On paper, with enough investment, it's definitely not impossible to get results with this kind of playstyle, but I can't say there's value in doing so when the amount that you have to invest in another damage niche is just so much less. As much as I dislike this idea, maybe the answer is just a 5-star Pella that applies asinine amounts of defense reduction or gives defense ignore to the party so that we can all go back to 1.x and just use the quantum set on everyone. That said, it really just might be that the requirements to effectively use a single unit to carry your team with just supports and sustains while not relying on something like break damage is just too high, and it might not really be that optimal anymore without having to sack the sustain slot for a 3rd support in the team instead of just running 2. This seems to be the formula that Hoyo has moved towards with how Super Break teams are built around pretty much everyone across the team dealing damage, except for on Mei I guess, and follow-up teams are similar with Robin adding extra damage procs to the entire team when her ult is active, and running a sub DPS like Topaz, Moze, or Hunt March alongside your main DPS. This game has changed a ton since 1.0 where this kind of playstyle was the best that we had. To be clear, it's not necessarily a bad thing. Hell, I'd even say that it actually leans towards good, because it means that there's multiple avenues of gameplay to pick from, instead of just picking one DPS to slam all your resources into per element, with the only thing mattering past that being your supports. The only real downside is that units that are built for this kind of role have to either find somewhere else they can fit in as a sub or dual DPS, or they just don't get much playtime. I guess that's the nature of it though. As your account develops, so do your options as a player, and that results in some of your older characters not being used so much. Personally, I'd say this is where the game should be looking into other avenues of letting you use your old characters, potentially by buffing them, as I discussed in a previous video. What do you think Hoyo could do to make the niche more competitive? Feel free to let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, that's my rant. As always, thank you very much for watching, subscribe, and maybe give my other videos a shot too.